Good morning, and isn't it weird that one of the most famous gaming mascots of all time is Sonic, yet the company that made them in the first place is but a shell of their former self? I know that's a bit of a weird question, but one of my favorite gaming companies is Sega. I just find the way that their consoles were an absolute icon of the era they were made very endearing. The way the Sega Master System made it so I didn't have to be creative when making a theme for myself. I mean, it has that uniform box art where they didn't quite know what they were doing yet. The Genesis with its very 90s aesthetic, completely embodying the cool kid style of the time. The Sega Saturn killing a company, and the Dreamcast with its 2000s beauty. But I'm getting ahead of myself. How did such a company begin, and how was it able to stare in the eyes of Nintendo, spit in their face, and then get buried 6 feet under? Let's take a bit of a look, and by a bit, I mean about 20 plus minutes. Sega originally started as Service Games in 1940, making coin-operated slot machines for the enjoyment of others. A few years later, the company sent a couple of their employees to Japan and later abbreviated the name of Service Games to simply Sega. They then went on to import slot machines from America for use in Japan. Also, they apparently narrowly avoided charges of bribery and tax evasion, which means, woo! Tax evasion is part of the Space Channel 5 canon, baby! Later, a man by the name of David Rosen, that will become more important later, realized that Japan needed you to have photos for your ID, rice ration cards, and employment. Keep in mind, these were the 50s, so the reasonable conclusion was to make a company to buy and sell photo booths they import from America. After that, he became aware of the increase in both leisure time and disposable income in Japan, and got straight to work importing American arcade machines. Specifically that of the hunting and shooting variety. Oh god, I just imagined Sonic with a gun. Later, in 1965, Rosen's company was acquired by, and I'm sorry if I butcher this name, Nihon Garaku Bosan, to form Sega Enterprises Ltd. They proceeded to transfer from importer to manufacturer, making parts used for their previously imported games, mostly because they constantly needed repair and they were unable to do anything about it. Sega then moved on to making arcade games with their breakout hit Periscope. Never heard of it? Me neither. Just know it was something to do with submarines, I think. It broke the milestone of first arcade machine to cost 25 cents to play, which you may be thinking, it costs like $1 to play Space Invaders now, why is that such a big deal? Well, this was the 1960s, so nowadays, what was 25 cents is now about $1.75, which is quite a lot. They shortly after stopped exporting their arcade games to America and Europe because people would just clone their games because, say it with me kids, piracy is a party! After that, they decided to take a risk and invest, putting all their money towards cryptocurrency, killing the company once and for all. Ah, wait, these are the 2023 notes. What they actually did was buy a 50% stake in a company named Kingdom of Oz, a company that does something like make arcades in malls in California, which is pretty specific for a dead company. But Sega later acquired all of Kingdom of Oz, making all of their arcades into Sega Centers, later being made into Chuck E. Cheese wannabes and renamed to That's Gotta Be a Joke. After that, there was a little thing called the arcade boom of the late 70s, making Sega a huge success, which later increased further by making even more successful games such as Head On, which was basically worse Pac-Man, which makes sense, because it was made before Pac-Man. They also licensed Frogger, which is news to me, so that's cool. In the early 1980s, a huge hit was taken by the arcade industry, making Sega lose a lot of money. But despite these losses, they were about to do what would launch them into stardom. The part you've all been waiting for, the home consoles. To talk about what America knew as the Sega Master System, we first have to talk about the Japanese version, which lived a much longer life than that of America's offerings. The Sega Master System in Japan was known as the SG-1000, living proof that no one during this time knew what the heck a video game system was, having one of the worst console names I've ever heard. Oh, to imagine a time when Choo Choo Rocket didn't exist. The console was much smaller than any other console at the time, being a nice white, blue, and red. Also introducing the Sega signature of having like a million redesigns. It was part of the third generation of consoles, being joined by the NES and Atari 7800. After that, they made the SG-1002, which also redesigned the controllers to be a bit more comfortable and quote-unquote optimized for gaming. This led to kind of the final redesign, the SG-1003, later renamed to the Sega Mark III. If you watch a lot of YouTube videos on old games and consoles, you may have heard them refer to the Master System as a localized Sega Mark III, which, if you're like me, made you wonder where was the Sega Mark II and 1? Well, now we both know. This was North America's first look into the amazing thing that was the Sega Master System, but not really. Nobody bought this thing. It sold less than both Nintendo and Atari's offerings, which getting beat by Atari is just sad. I really just insulted a 40-year-old game console, didn't I? It obviously had some great games like Alex Kidd, Fantasy Zone, Castle of Illusion, Golden Axe, and Phantasy Star. Now that I think of it, this console had much better games than those stupid, I mean amazing, boxes let off. Somehow, this console was a huge success in Brazil of all places, still being sold the latest of 2016, which is crazy that such an old console can be great fun in other countries for as long as possible. See kids, you don't need the PS5. During this time, they also established their claw machines in arcades having those absolutely stupid two-prong claw designs, where you can't get anything inside of it. Anyway, although they failed on the first go, this can't be repeated behavior from them, right? Right? In all seriousness, this was one of the first non-failures for this company, but not for long. This was an absolute staple of the 90s, really being an absolute revolution for the company, having an amazing sound chip with a headphone jack for some reason. I don't know why it had it, but I find it pretty snazzy. Having great graphics and one of the most memorable ad campaigns where they basically just looked at the SNES and thought to themselves, slander! This console was also the first appearance of Sonic, which the first one isn't good. I'm sorry, it just isn't. But good thing they were able to make a much better game, that being Sonic 2, having another one of the amazing marketing stunts used by Sega throughout the years, this time being Sonic Tuesday. Whoever made these ad campaigns should have been paid more than the CEO. There were also a whole lot of other games, such as Gunstar Heroes, Comic Zone, Earthworm Jim, all the other Sonic games on the system, Shinobi, Rise Star, McDonald's Treasure Land Adventure, no that's not a joke, Streets of Rage, more Phantasy Star games, and of course, the best game, Toe Jam and Earl. There are honestly a ridiculous amount of amazing, well-made games for the system, having some of the greatest displays of 2D gameplay out there. Another great or somewhat terrible thing about the system, depending on how you look at it, the fact there are so many revisions of the console, each with their own pros and cons. The first model Genesis is probably what you immediately think of when you hear the words Sega Genesis, and which happens to be the one I own. There's 3 or more different models of the Sega Genesis Model 1, a couple of them being with the vague term high-definition graphics on the top, the other 2 being without that text. Funny story about the non-high-definition graphics model. There's a common myth that the one without the text have worse graphics, but I recently did a bit of research about that, considering I have one without the text and I thought I got somewhat ripped off. So here's my findings. There are 2 models that don't have the text, and the only difference is the sound chip. The later released one having significantly worse sound. Here's how you can tell. The better one has a huge gap between this weird switch on the back and the little lip, while the worse one doesn't have said gap. Anyway, the next model was the Genesis Model 2, which was a much more streamlined model, losing a lot of the personality, switching AV out port types, and, again, having much worse sound. That's a common theme with the Genesis. The sound chip was so good that it was super hard to replicate, which is a main complaint of Genesis emulation. Either way, I kind of like the look of the Model 2, but it will never live up to the beautiful design of the Model 1, or even the Saturn. Then came the Genesis 3. It didn't even get the honor of the model name. It's just a really small and cheap version of the console that got rid of a lot of the features, which is a common thing that game companies do for some reason, just completely ruining the console. The most notable feature omitted from this version, it was the lack of support for the Sega 32X and Sega CD, and oh god, I actually have to talk about these things. The first of these to be made was the Sega CD in 1932. 1932! The first of these to be made was the Sega CD in 1992, widely advertising its CD audio, which isn't that big of a deal, and also its ability to use FMV because of the increased storage space. It didn't actually increase the power of the Genesis, like as many people think. It was just a larger storage space because of the discs. This add-on was a flop, with the most notable thing to come from it was the indirect creation of the ESRB because of Night Trap, which isn't even a good game. Which I guess I also have to talk about the congressional hearings of 1993, which kind of sounds like someone being tried for murder, but no, it was more like some 40-year-old white dudes complaining about the fact that Mortal Kombat was too violent for a good few hours. These hearings came out with two important results. One, the reason that you have to play Kirby Triple Deluxe instead of Grand Theft Auto, also known as the ESRB, and the most important outcome, Nintendo's response. Revenge slander! If you've never heard these hearings, you can just hear Nintendo bullying Sega by saying things like, Night Trap is a very disgusting thing and will never ever appear on a Nintendo console, so you know they were being serious. A year after this, Sega released their next flop of an add-on, the Sega 32X. This may look like an oversized Sonic & Knuckles cartridge, but I can assure you, it's much cooler. I mean, it can play Knuckles Chaotix, so obviously it's better. Yeah, this thing doesn't have very many games, yet it really pushed the limits of the Genesis. This is because it actually added power to the Genesis, requiring its own power source and everything. It doubles the bits of the console, which, even when the whole bits spiel was much more popular than it is now, no one knew what they were. The understanding was basically just the more bits, the gooder. So because of this, Sega made the 32X, and it has like 30 games total for the system, and like the Sega CD, this flopped, but this time even harder. These two add-ons together would really paint the beginning of the end for Sega. Oh, we're only halfway through? Sounds about right. The Genesis actually scared Nintendo for a bit there, but they still found out a way to mess everything up. Speaking of messing everything up, I didn't really know where else to put these, so I'm just gonna put them where I feel they best fit, right between the Genesis and the Sega Saturn. The first of the handhelds was the Sega Game Gear, which was kind of like a handheld but less powerful Master System, as many handhelds are, as in the GBA being a less powerful and handheld SNES, and the DS being the same but with the N64. But in the case of the Game Gear, it was large, it was bad, but it didn't deserve that fate. It has some honestly pretty good games, such as Gunstar Heroes again, Wonder Boy 3, Sonic 2, which isn't like the Genesis Sonic 2 at all, and Power Strike 2. Keep in mind, while I talk about this, all of these games were in full color, but that came at a cost. Well, actually, two big costs. One, it just devoured AA batteries like me on a Wednesday night. The other problem was that even though it was fully colored and hogged all your batteries, it didn't have a backlight. I know it was made in 1990 and it took Nintendo till like 2000 to do it, but if you can't even beat Nintendo, what are you doing? Oh, being Sega, that's right. The Game Gear didn't entirely flop. It actually, and this is about to sound really sad, sold more than the Dreamcast. How did it do that? I have no clue, it's probably Sonic Chaos related, but there is one more Sega handheld that was made, the Sega Pico! Just kidding, I'm not talking about that thing. What do you think I look like? Someone who cares about the Sega Pico? The real other Sega handheld was the Sega Nomad. The fact this exists is very impressive to me. It is a handheld that plays real Sega Genesis cartridges. Was it only $10 cheaper than the normal Genesis and released 6 years after? Yes, but it's still really cool. Too bad it was made by Sega and proceeded to sell a pathetic 1 million units. When the Atari Lynx lived a better life than you, you know you had some neglectful parents. Those parents obviously being Sega. Anyway, now that I've talked about the pure stupidity that is Sega handhelds, now to talk about the pure stupidity that is the Sega Saturn. During this generation of games, there were 3 main competitors. Well, technically there were 5, taking into account the Atari Jaguar and Amiga CD32, but I'm not going to talk about those things. What do you think I am? Irrelevant? Don't answer that. The real 3 competitors were the N64, the very first PlayStation, and what we're talking about, the Sega Saturn. Nintendo decided that it would be a genius idea to keep their games on cartridges for this generation, which would prove to be a pretty big mistake for the company. This mistake was inflated even further once they decided to cut off their deal with Sony to make the CD add-on, making Sony create one of the best-selling consoles of all time out of spite. So considering Sega was actually willing to move on from cartridges and move to their arguably superior disc format, how did Sega mess up? Most people think it was just their lack of games, but all the consoles have a lack of games until they succeed. The real issue with the Saturn was their reluctance to move on to 3D. While the Saturn had some of the greatest and best looking 2D games of all time, they didn't want to move on just yet, investing all of their money into the best 2D processor possible. Before the launch of the console, however, they realized that 3D was the way of the future, and they wouldn't succeed without it. So they set to work throwing together a 3D processor for it. While the 2D games are now known as some of the greatest of all time, the 3D games don't necessarily hold up all that well. There are still some really good games for the system, such as the previously mentioned Panzer Dragoon, Nights into Dreams, Virtua Fighter, Saturn Bomberman, and Sonic Jam. Where this console really shines is with the imports with games such as Radiant Silvergun, Magic Knight Rare, Dungeons & Dragons Collection, Princess Crown, Police Knots, and many, many more. If you've seen other people on YouTube with the Saturn, which I say other as if I own one when I don't. Anyway, others with the Saturn almost always have at least one import due to the lackluster game selection in America, while the Japan library is superb, which is no doubt due to the lukewarm reception and poor sales of the console in North American market. However, in Japan, it sold a bit more, and I feel like those in Japan were at least a bit more forgiving for the whole 2D-centered thing, while American audiences just really hated the thought of 2D, and were basically just like this. So with the whole 2D fiasco, Sega wasn't doing too hot this generation. The Saturn had 2 different models, but only one in America. There's a bunch of different looking ones, but I'll show you the ones that are most important. Boom, regular American one, and the Japanese one that says, "This is cool." It's just the most strange thing to put on a console, but whatever, moving on. In conclusion, the Sega Saturn was a pretty cool console. Sega just had no idea what they were doing. Now to talk about arguably their best console, their final send-off to the console market, the Sega Dreamcast. Now this is cool. The Sega Dreamcast was the last hurrah of the company, making some of the most iconic games of the entire company's library, such as Shenmue, Sonic Adventure, The Peak of Humanity, Soul Calibur, Crazy Taxi, Phantasy Star Online, Not You, Samba de Amigo, The House of the Dead, Space Channel 5, Space Channel 5 Part 2, Space Channel 5 Part 3, Revenge of CNN, and even more Bomberman games. So as you can clearly see, the console had amazing games, and for the design of the console is absolutely iconic, being, in my opinion, one of the best console designs of all time. The Dreamcast fully embraced 3D, unlike the Saturn, showing off how great the format could really look. However, in this generation, it had some big competitors, with the best-selling console of all time, the PS2, the GameCube, and the original Xbox. While the PS2 sold 155 million units, the original Xbox and GameCube both only sold around 20 million. So the Dreamcast couldn't have done worse than that. Oh, Sega, you swine! So yeah, there's a few things that ruined the amazing track this console was set on, but we'll loop back to that in a bit. There was only one model because of the aforementioned failure, but I like to think of it as the design was absolute perfection from the start. There were only two themes released in America, that being the white one that everyone thinks of when they think of Dreamcast, and the Sega Sports model, which is black and honestly looks better if you like a more uniform look. One of the standout features of the Dreamcast were the things that you would put inside of those awkward looking holes on the controller, the VMU. The virtual memory unit, typically referred to as a VMU, which is what I'll be referring to it from now on, was a super cool idea which I kinda wish was tried again. It was a memory card, much like a more sleek version of the N64 memory card, but this has a bit of a twist. It's a fully fledged handheld system. A very rudimentary handheld? Yes, but it will enable you to play mini-games related to the games on the actual console itself. It may also let you access special features in the game, which may lead to emulation issues, but you know, piracy isn't legal, and I'm legally obligated to tell you that it isn't a good thing to do. Piracy is a party! Wow, that was that long ago that it added the black and white and reverb filters. I have a complete side note here, so if you want to skip my stupid tangent, skip to this time right here. Editing magic, am I right? So in the beautiful year of 2000, there was an amazing marketing stunt done by Sega to promote the game Jet Set Radio. So their genius idea was to make a competition called Graffiti is Art, and like the name said, they let people make graffiti. 5 finalists were then flown out to San Francisco so that they could vandalize for the sake of Sega. But the mayor of San Francisco really hated the idea of this happening, so he tried to step in. But Sega acquired their licenses completely legally, so they were given the go-ahead to do it. That's just a little fun story that I really like and felt like sharing, so I hope you enjoyed that. Anyway, those of you that have just joined back with us, now to continue with our Dreamcast history. Another cool feature was the GD-ROM, which has a full gigabyte of storage on them. At this point in time, people found it hard to believe that one might even fill up a regular CD, so a full gigabyte was insane. A game that showed this on full display was Shenmue, coming on a whopping 4 discs, well, technically 3 for the main game, but whatever, each of those having to fill a gigabyte of space. It was a technical marvel for the time, and is still a very impressive game today. With all of this praise I've been giving the console, you may be wondering, what was the reason for it failing? Well, that was for a few reasons. One of the main reasons everyone always points to was it was just too ahead of its time. It was very ambitious as a console, and it just wasn't fit for the console market at the time. Another reason may be that Sega fans just moved on at that point. Sega was starting to be a bad name in the video game industry, and just wasn't viewed as highly as they once were. Even now, you think of Sega and you either think back fondly at either the Genesis, or the Dreamcast, or maybe even the Sega Master System. Sega just wasn't what they used to be. But with those faults set in place, the grave had already been dug for Sega. All they needed to do was get in. But they instead threw Atari in as a sacrifice and kept living. After they made their big imprint on the game industry and left, they decided to become a third-party developer, releasing all types of Sonic for the consoles after the Dreamcast. Well, to say that they only did Sonic would be a bit overselling their laziness. For a bit, they made sequels and ports of their Dreamcast games. The Xbox got Shenmue 2 and Jet Set Radio Future. Guess what Nintendo got? Well, that's Sonic. But as the console generations went on, more Sega games came out, most being bad Sonic games, and that one good one. They've also since released a lot of bundles of their older games, whether that be Master System, usually the Genesis, definitely not the Saturn, and maybe Dreamcast. So that's what happened to the legendary company that was Sega. As of now, many people look at the video game industry and think, who's gonna be the next Sega? And if I'm gonna be honest, I think it's gonna be Nintendo. How could that possibly be Microsoft or Sony? If all of a sudden every single person on Earth said, I hate PlayStation or vice versa, whether it's Sony or Microsoft, do you think they care? Microsoft will keep doing stupid stuff like charging $150 for a Windows license, and Sony will go back to selling fridges or whatever they do. So maybe they will stop making consoles sometime and just go third party. In 2048, Animal Crossing on the Xbox might exist, and that terrifies me. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Sega's history, and if you don't mind, I'm gonna excuse myself because I spat milk everywhere. I've got this down, so... I don't have this down, so...